Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, over the past 5 months, I have repeatedly expressed concerns about the Environmental Protection Agency's decision to issue backdoor climate regulations under the Clean Air Act. I spoke at length about this issue here on the Senate floor in September and then again in December. And I've also discussed it with dozens of groups from all across the political spectrum and found that there is remarkably widespread agreement with my views on this issue. As the EPA moves closer and closer to issuing these regulations, I continue to believe that this command and control approach is our worst option for reducing the emissions blamed for climate change. I also believe that with so much at stake, Congress must be given time to develop an appropriate and more responsible solution. And so today, Mr. President, after consultation with the parliamentarian, I have come to the floor to introduce a resolution of disapproval under the Congressional Review Act that would prevent the EPA from acting on its own. Senator Lincoln of Arkansas, Senator Nelson of Nebraska, and Senator Landrieu of Louisiana have joined me as co-sponsors on this bipartisan resolution, along with 35 of my Republican colleagues. And, Mr. President, I've also come to the floor this morning to reaffirm and to re-emphasize my previous remarks on this issue. And given what has been alleged about my intentions, I believe that this debate needs to be directed back to its substance and away from the ad hominem attacks and the red herrings that have been thrown out in the past few weeks. There's a legitimate and a substantive debate to be had over whether the EPA should be allowed to issue command and control regulations, and I welcome that debate. If there are any senators who support the unprecedented regulatory intrusion that the EPA is pursuing, then I would hope that those members would come to the floor and explain why. I strongly oppose that approach, however, and I hope that my colleagues will listen to my explanations as to why I feel as strongly about this as I do. Our bipartisan resolution deals with an incredibly important issue, and that is whether or not members of this body are comfortable with the actions that EPA will take under its current interpretation of the Clean Air Act. I'm not comfortable with those actions, and neither are the senators who have already agreed to add their names to this effort. The Clean Air Act was written by Congress to regulate criteria pollutants, not greenhouse gases, and its implementation remains subject to oversight and guidance from elected representatives. We should continue our work to pass meaningful energy and climate legislation, but in the meantime, we cannot turn a blind eye to the EPA's efforts to impose backdoor climate regulations with no input from Congress. The decision to offer this resolution was brought about by what will happen in the wake of EPA's decision to issue the endangerment finding. For you see, it's not merely a finding, it's actually a floodgate. And under the guise of protecting the environment, it's set to unleash a wave of damaging new regulations that will wash over and further submerge our struggling economy. Make no mistake, if Congress allows this to happen, there will be severe consequences to our economy. Businesses will be forced to cut jobs, if not move outside our borders or close their doors for good, perhaps. Domestic energy production will be severely restricted, increasing our dependence on foreign suppliers and threatening our national security. Housing will become less affordable, consumer goods more expensive, as the impacts of the EPA's regulations are felt in the towns and the cities and on farms all across America. Mr. President, my home state is a perfect example of why we must proceed with utmost caution. If these regulations are allowed, the consequences for Alaska will be devastating. Hundreds of facilities will be subject to much greater regulation, including large hospitals, hotels, fish processors, mines, Energy-intensive businesses throughout the state will be forced to acquire, install, and operate new equipment and technologies. And in many cases, this will prove impossible because the technologies are either too expensive or they simply do not exist. Now, because the EPA's proposed regulations are such a blunt tool, they will hit my state's energy sector particularly hard. The continued operation of existing businesses and future endeavors alike, including Alaska's 3 refineries that we have, the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System, we call it TAPS, and the proposed Alaska Natural Gas Pipeline, will all be jeopardized. And take, for example, the Flint Hills refineries. This is located just south of Fairbanks. This refinery purchases royalty oil out of the pipeline at premium rates, which is critically important to the continued operation of TAPS itself. That 800-mile-long pipeline has been challenged by decreasing throughput as lower volumes are taking longer to arrive from the North Slope. Oil is also arriving at the Flint Hills refinery at lower temperatures than it used to be, which requires more energy to heat and crack the crude oil into the marketable fuels that Alaskans depend upon. The Flint Hills refinery already struggles to keep its jet fuel output at competitive rates in order to maintain Anchorage's status as a major center for global air cargo. It also faces a relatively inelastic market in Alaska for its other fuel products. The EPA will likely be unable, and in any event unwilling, to address these issues under its command and control climate regulations. I mentioned the Alaska Natural Gas Pipeline, something that we are working very hard to allow to come about. But the construction and operation of an Alaska natural gas pipeline would be significantly hobbled by the EPA. And the main reason for this relates to compressor stations, which maintain a pipeline's pressures and enable movement of the gas. There is no known best available control technology, as would be required under the Clean Air Act, for reducing carbon dioxide emissions from compressors, and no good options for compliance. I cannot overstate how important these facilities and these projects are to Alaska and to America. Our refineries help ensure the state's status as a transportation hub, as well as a strategic base for our military operations. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline System delivers hundreds of thousands of barrels of oil to Americans each day, and most of the revenue for Alaska's state's budget. The proposed natural gas pipeline is a pillar of our future economy that will bring Americans billions of cubic feet of clean-burning natural gas. And collectively, these projects mean well-paying jobs for thousands of hardworking Alaskans. And while the EPA's endangerment finding may be described as an effort to protect our environment, it would actually damage the very foundation of my state's economy. And Alaska isn't the only state that would face dire economic consequences. My colleagues need to consider the ripple effect of this decision and the heavy economic burden that it will place on those throughout the lower 48. And this was foreshadowed in New Mexico back in September. In December, Kentucky faced the same situation. Arkansas, just last week. The EPA has ordered regulators in each of these states to go back to the drawing board on plans to build new power plants. And these decisions were all the results of this EPA's interpretation of the Clean Air Act and represent a fundamental departure from the permitting process that Congress had envisioned for this statute. Mr. President, the implications are clear. The people who live in those states are already feeling the effects. Construction is being delayed, jobs are not being created, or more importantly, being filled. Commerce is suffering, and depending on what becomes of these proposed plants, local residents may have to brace for a spike in energy prices as well.